It's the end of the year. You know what that means, right? That's right. It's time to go through every single book I read the past year and rank them from my least favorite to my favorite. And this past year, I ended up reading a total of 17 books, which for me is probably a personal best. I don't think I've ever read that many books in a single year before. And although I am ranking these books from my least favorite to my favorite, even the books low on the list aren't necessarily bad books. It just means that they're books I didn't enjoy as much as the ones that are higher up on my list. So let's get started with my least favorite books and then work up to my favorite books from 2022. Starting off at the bottom, we have The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. This book I was very conflicted on because there are aspects of this book that I really like. The fact that it's Arthurian legend but told from the perspective of the women in the story is a really interesting take on an established story. However, I just had so many problems with a lot of the characters in this book. So many of the characters I just really didn't connect with and really didn't like reading, and so many chapters of this book is dedicated to characters that I just found completely boring, and it really sapped away a lot of my enjoyment from this story. Now that being said, although I did end up finishing this book, there were multiple times I was going through this book where I was very, very close to giving up and just putting the book down. I can honestly say that I'm glad I did end up finishing the book because although it is at the bottom of my list, it's still an okay book and it definitely has a good story. It's just a lot of the characters in it I really didn't connect with and I really didn't like reading about them. Next, we have The Catcher in the Rye. Now this is of course a classic book, but my problem with this book is kind of similar to my problem with The Mists of Avalon. The main character in this book I really just couldn't connect with. It's essentially about a teenager that has all these emotional problems going on in his life, and maybe if I was reading this book as a teenager myself, I'd be able to connect more with him, but as an adult, honestly, I just found this character incredibly annoying, and I really didn't care about him. Now, the overall story is, of course, fine. It's definitely a good story. The writing style is very well done, in my opinion, but since I couldn't connect with that main character, I did have to rank it pretty low on my list. And then next we have The Rise of Kyoshi. So this is actually my wife's book that I ended up reading this past year because I was such a fan of The Last Airbender television show and kind of an okay fan of The Legend of Korra. This was definitely an enjoyable read for myself, but it is very different from what I normally focus on. This is more of a traditional YA type of story, and although that is okay, I don't really have a problem with that, I just didn't really get connected to the characters and the story all that much. That being said, if you are a fan of The Last Airbender television show or The Legend of Korra, I definitely would recommend you read this book. I thought it was pretty fascinating, especially coming from watching those shows and then reading this book. But if you're not a fan of those shows, you probably won't really want to read this book because you won't have that background information to really connect with the characters and their struggles. Following The Rise of Kyoshi, we have its sequel, The Shadow of Kyoshi. This is again a pretty good book, especially if you're a fan of the television shows, and I found the sequel to be a little bit more enjoyable than The Rise of Kyoshi because I found the pacing to be more even throughout and the overall story to also be more engaging. Again, if you're not a fan of the television show, or if you've never seen the television shows, I probably wouldn't recommend these books. Next, we have The Fires of Heaven. This is book 5 in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. I absolutely love the Wheel of Time series. It's probably one of my favorite fantasy series that I'm currently reading through right now. This book, however, is probably near the bottom of all the Wheel of Time books I've read so far. It's definitely not a bad book. It's still an absolutely fantastic book. However, I read it earlier in the year, and honestly, it's pretty forgetful. I don't really remember, other than the big things that happen in the book, a lot of the smaller things that happen. The one main thing I do remember from this book, though, is that I remember it being kind of a slog to get through. Not necessarily that it was a boring book, but just that it was so dense with so much I'll say unnecessary detail that it just takes such a long time to read, and honestly, it probably could have been a much shorter read, which probably would have made it more enjoyable for myself. That being said, still a fantastic book, and if you are a fan of the Wheel of Time series, I mean, honestly, you'd probably still like this book anyways. Following that, we have Foundation by Isaac Asimov. This is the first book in the original trilogy of the Foundation series, and I went into this book kind of expecting something different than what I got from this. This book is more of a collection of short stories than one continuous story, and maybe if I went into this book knowing that, I would have ranked it higher, but since it was kind of a surprise to me and it wasn't what I was expecting, I did kind of have to lower it down on my list a little bit. That being said, it's still a great book, and honestly, I still would recommend anyone that's into science fiction to read this book, especially its sequels. An absolutely fantastic trilogy, in my opinion. Next, we have Dead Boy's Game and The Broken Vow. I gotta say, this book really surprised me. It was probably the biggest surprise from this past year from a book that I've read. I went in thinking that it would be a totally fine read, but probably nothing to write home about. Well, as I got into this book, it really grabbed my attention to the point where I ended up reading through this whole book in just a couple of days. That normally doesn't happen when I'm reading a book, especially because I have so many things going on in my personal life. I can't ever really get too attached to a book that I just end up staying up late at night to finish it as quick as I can. With this book, I absolutely did that though, which was kind of a surprise. And for that reason, that's actually why I ranked this book so high up on my list from 2022. And then next we have Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is of course the first book in the Mistborn series, and this book, although I did really enjoy it, I went into this book with my expectations probably too high. This is the first Brandon Sanderson book I've ever read, and if you've been anywhere on the internet, you know the hype surrounding this author is pretty high. So I went in thinking like, wow, one of his highest ranked series from one of the highest ranked fantasy authors right now, this must be one of the greatest books ever. And although it is a really good book, it was still a little hard not to feel disappointed after I ended up finishing it, and for that reason it's not ranked higher up on my list. Next we have World War Z. This is a very different book, especially in comparison to other books that I've read from this past year, but I gotta say, I really enjoyed this book. It's about a zombie apocalypse, but it's written in a very unique way. It's kind of like a historical retelling of the events after the zombie apocalypse. So how people go on living their lives, how it's impacted the entire planet. It's really a fascinating read. And if you're into zombie-related books, or just fiction books in general, I probably would recommend you check out this book. I was pretty surprised how much I enjoyed it. And next we have The Dragon Reborn. This is book 3 in the Wheel of Time series. This book I would rank actually pretty high in the Wheel of Time books that I've read so far. This book, you can really see how certain events that take place are going to have lasting impacts that's going to affect the series later on. Also with this book, you can really get more attached to the characters because in my opinion, Robert Jordan started to really delve into each individual character, their own struggles that they're facing, and their own relationships that they have. So reading through this book, it's far more of an engaging read, and for that reason, I ranked it a lot higher than The Fires of Heaven. Next, we have The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This is an absolute classic in the science fiction genre. I mean, H.G. Wells is honestly one of the greatest science fiction writers ever, in my opinion. And this book I really enjoyed. It's a pretty short book. This edition's just about 150 pages. But in those 150 pages, Wells was able to pack so much detail, so many action set pieces, so much character building. It's really fascinating from beginning to end, and I gotta say, if you're a fan of science fiction, definitely check out this book. Following The War of the Worlds, we have Contact by Carl Sagan. This is, again, another science fiction book. However, this one is very different. This is honestly the most realistic science fiction book I've ever read. It's about what would happen if aliens make contact with humankind on Earth. And the way it's written is just incredibly realistic. It talks about how the Earth is impacted by this. It talks about how society's impacted by this first contact, about what governments do when this contact is made, and how individuals are impacted by this. It's definitely a fascinating read, and if you're a fan of science fiction, just like The War of the Worlds, I would definitely recommend you check out this book. Carl Sagan is honestly one of my favorite authors, mainly for his nonfiction astronomy books, but this book was absolutely amazing as well. And next we have Second Foundation, which is the third and final book in the Foundation trilogy. I gotta say, although I really enjoyed this book, it isn't quite as good as the second book in the trilogy, but the way Isaac Asimov was able to close out the trilogy with this book was really masterfully done in my opinion. Pretty much all the loose ends get tied up, and the closure you get is very satisfying. I didn't really have any complaints I could say about this book, which is why I ranked it so high up on my list for this year. Next, we have the Silmarillion by JRR Tolkien. This book is probably one of the most incredible reads I've ever had. Just the fact that Tolkien was able to put so much detail, so much world building into such a, I mean, it's not necessarily a huge book, but into such a compact book is really incredible. I ended up reading through this book earlier in the year, and even though I probably only grasped like 50% of all the details that are in this book, if 50%, you still get so much detail, and honestly, I really want to read this book again because there is so much to learn in this single book. It's really incredible, and for that reason, I ended up ranking it this high in my books for 2022. And for my third favorite book from this past year is this, The Shadow Rising, which is book 4 in the Wheel of Time series. Out of every Wheel of Time book I've read so far, this is definitely my favorite. In this book, you get so much more detail on the individual characters, and you can really see how they start to come in on their own. It makes for a far more engaging read than the other Wheel of Time books. Not that they're bad in my opinion, but this book has been so far my favorite in the Wheel of Time series. And number 2 on my list is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This is definitely a classic science fiction book, and after reading this, it's not hard to see why. This book is amazing. It is very short. This edition is like just 100 pages, but the amount of detail, just like in War of the Worlds, that Wells is able to put in such a short book is really incredible. This is, of course, about a character that builds a time machine and travels to the future, and just seeing what Wells is able to put into this book as a metaphor for what's currently, or was currently, but still is currently going on in our society, really incredible, and definitely, if you're a fan of science fiction or just classic novels in general, definitely check out this book. Absolutely recommend it. And my number 1 favorite book that I read in 2022 is Foundation and Empire by Isaac Asimov. This is the second book in the Foundation trilogy, and I gotta say, all of the characters, the setting, the conflicts that's going on, the mystery surrounding the conflict, everything that Asimov was able to put in this book made for probably the most engaging book I've ever read. It is definitely my favorite book from 2022, but honestly, it might be my favorite book that I've ever read. It is definitely that good, and if you're a fan of science fiction, or just fiction books in general, I definitely recommend you read the Foundation trilogy. The first book, while still pretty good, is definitely not nearly as good as the second book. Second book is my favorite, third book is still very good, but this book was really great in my opinion. Honestly, I wish I could go back in time and read through the trilogy again for the first time, because it was an adventure. I can't say enough good things about it. And those are all the books I read in 2022, ranked from my least favorite going to my favorite book. Not that my least favorite book was necessarily a bad book, they're definitely still good books, all of them in my opinion. Just didn't really get to enjoy them as much as I did, my favorite books. Let me know if you have any comments down below, and let me know what you're looking forward to reading in 2023. Thanks for watching.